Welcome to Rick on Life, brought to you by the Liberty Beacon Media Project. I'm your host, Rick Amitin, and this is where we love to talk about things that impact our lives. Today we're going to be talking about adoption and fatherhood with Eduardo Quintana. Eduardo is founder and CEO of Manly Training Ministries. He's a blogger, he hosts a podcast, and he is a recent author. Eduardo works a full-time job as an area manager for a Texas restaurant chain, and he holds an Associate of Science degree in biochemistry. Eduardo is married, and he and his wife have adopted 3 children, and he lives in San Antonio, Texas. Eduardo, welcome to Rick on Life.
Hey, Rick, how are you? Thank you for inviting me.
Sure, I'm really happy to have you. Listen, November is National Adoption Month, and I was eager to get you on the show. Of course, we get the curveball of a holiday in there and a few other challenging schedule things. But it is the 28th of November, so we are making my goal, so mission accomplished. And I want to talk a little bit about this issue of adoption. And I know that for some people, adoption is completely out of the question. They wouldn't even consider adoption as an option. But for other people, adopting a child is perhaps their greatest hope for having children. And you made us aware of the fact that on your website that there are probably over 4,000 kids in Texas alone who are awaiting adoption.
That's
and
correct.
I found nationally that there are over 400,000 kids in the foster care system. And out of that, you've got about 100,000 of those children who are waiting for adoption. Those numbers are staggering, and it makes it a real issue in our nation. Why did you and your wife choose to adopt? If you can share with us your story about that.
Rick, you hit the nail on the head when you said there's a lot of people who that's their only way to have a family would be through adoption. See, my wife and I had been married for 19 years before we adopted, and we hadn't had our own children. And so we started to think about that and said, there's definitely a need for adoption. Our first thought when it came to adoption was to adopt overseas. We had gone to a seminar for an organization called the Great Wall of China, where they were adopting children from China. And we liked it. We liked that. We liked this, except it was very expensive. We just couldn't afford it. Both parents had to travel to China twice, and that alone would be expensive, in addition to all the other fees. So we started looking at other countries, and we found out that they were all pretty expensive. So we looked at national adoptions here in the United States. The first thing we looked at was adoption agencies. And again, it was very difficult. There are different kinds of adoption agencies, as you probably already know. There are those that just work directly with orphanages, and those are really expensive, just as expensive as overseas. And then there's those that work with women who are pregnant and they don't want to have the abortion, but they can't keep the baby. They might be on their 7th or 8th child, or they know that CPS is probably going to end up taking them away. So they decide to go ahead and choose a family for their baby and all we had to do was pay the medical bills, which is pretty expensive as well. And then one day my wife was listening to the radio, and this ad came on for a local agency here in San Antonio that works with foster children, and said, if you're looking to adopt, fostering to adopt is the way to go. So we went and looked at that, and we got certified to be foster parents as a treatment home. We fostered a few children, but we couldn't really find the child we wanted. We really wanted a baby. And the caseworkers kept telling us, babies are out of the question. You can't adopt a baby. It's impossible. There are a million homes opening up for babies, and there's only a handful of babies all across the nation. And we're like, okay. So the first thing we did was tell them we want a baby. We have faith enough to believe that, and if this is God's will, we're going to have a baby. 2 weeks later, I kid you not, they're calling us about babies. Oh, there's this baby that needs a home. And there's this other baby that needs a home. And so we would look at the cases and decide whether we wanted to take that risk or not. And we finally, one day I was at work, and I get a call from the caseworker saying, hey, Mr. Quintana, there's this baby at the hospital that was born, can't go home with mom. This case is going to definitely end up for adoption. And without hesitation, I just fell on my knees and thanked God, said, yes, this is the baby. Well, you haven't seen him. I don't need to see him. I know. And so we went and picked him up the very next day, my wife and I.
Wow.
And, yeah.
Wow.
And so we got this brand new baby. We haven't slept in 3 weeks. You know how it is to have a brand new baby. 3 weeks later, caseworker calls us and says, Mr. Quintana, I have this 3-year-old that needs a home. Parental rights have already been terminated. And we're like, her name was Miranda. Miranda, what makes you think that we can take care of a 3-year-old right now? We haven't slept for 3 weeks. It would be a dangerous environment for a 3-year-old to be in where parents haven't slept for 3 weeks. And she was like, no, he's very mellow. And his name is Eduardo.
Wow.
And that was my name. So I was like, okay, bring him over. So
Wow.
that was the second one. And then the third one came a year later.
Now, they're not related. The children are not related?
No.
So how long ago has that been now?
Well, the youngest is 5. So the last time we adopted a child was about 4 years ago, because it was about a year after he was born that we were able to adopt him.
What are their names?
The youngest one is Joseph. The second child, he's 6 years old. His name is Itzhak, and that means Isaac in Hebrew. And then the oldest is Eddie, or Eduardo.
That's fantastic. So you really didn't have a traditional adoption experience then. This sort of came to you outside of the normal go in, apply for a baby, see if you can qualify, or did you still have some of that you had to deal with?
Well, we had to deal with the foster to adopt part. Anytime you're fostering a child.
So you had done that already then? Yeah.
Yeah. The end goal of fostering is to reunite the family, so that for the child to go back with its parents.
Right.
And that was very difficult for us to deal with. But in addition to that, in order to become a foster parent, you have to go through classes and apply, background checks, home visits, all sorts of stuff. And so, yes, we sort of kind of went through a process in order to become adoptive parents with the children we had. Not the same process that you would go through an adoption agency, but very similar.
What would you say are the 3, let's use just the number 3 here. What would be your 3 biggest challenges to being an adoptive parent? And then what would be your 3 greatest rewards being an adoptive parent?
I think the biggest challenges and rewards are Eddie, Itzhak, and Joseph. That's the 3 right there. I'm glad you used the number 3 because I got 3 boys. Yeah. And this is a very difficult question to answer, so I wanted to be kind of funny by saying that. But it's true. I never had a dad. I grew up fatherless. And I found myself one day at 2 o'clock in the morning on the rocking chair, soothing my baby as he woke up in the middle of the night, and it was my turn to take care of the baby. My wife and I took turns. One night it was hers, the next night was mine. That way we could at least get one good night of sleep every other day. And so it was my turn, and I was reading a parenting book as I was trying to soothe him to go to sleep because I was so afraid that I wouldn't be a good dad. And I realized as I was praying through this parenting book, and it happened to be a Christian parenting book, although I had read some secular ones too, that I felt deep inside me something telling me, if you want to be a good father, you need to look at the Father of fathers, at God. Read the Bible. Highlight everything, and I grabbed a blue highlighter, and I started right away, and I highlighted everything in blue that had to do with being a father, how God treats us as his children, how we're supposed to be his fathers, etc. And when I was done, I had the best parenting book anybody could ever have. So that is the challenge, and also the best, number 1. The second thing, I think, was the fact that I didn't know how to be a good husband. The reason I couldn't be a good husband is because I didn't have that father figure in my life. And so although we've been married for 25 years, it's always a challenge, not understanding. And so it's been a challenge for me to show my children now at their age that they're at, what a good husband looks like, because I need a role model that.
Sure.
They need to grow up to understand how they're going to treat their wives and how they're going to treat women in general. And so that's been a second challenge. The good part of that is that I have learned, sometimes not the easy way, and sometimes just by the grace of God, what it takes to be a good husband.
Sure.
And so, again, I took the Bible and I started writing, not writing, started reading the Bible and highlighting in yellow everything that had to do with being a good husband. And I came up with a pretty good manual on husbandry. So those are the two. I'm not too sure about a third one, other than the fact that at my age, most men are becoming empty nesters and trying to enjoy a little bit more of their money and traveling and stuff. And right now, it's toys and expensive birthday parties and
Sure.
forget the traveling. It's just it's all about the boys right now. So that I'm not complaining. Like I said in my book, this is good,
Sure.
very good, but it is a challenge.
Well, I'm sure there are lots of challenges and rewards, but thanks for sharing those. For people who would like to get involved with an adoption and would like to have children that way, there's so many horror stories out there of, like, I have a cousin and his wife who have been trying to adopt for a long time, and they've gone through a couple of agencies. They've spent a ton of money, and for one reason or another, in the end, they did not end up with a child. And I do know that a lot of people, for probably a variety of reasons, when they're considering adopting, immediately think about children overseas. But there are these 100,000 plus kids right here in this country. And I'm sure that there is a big age gap among those kids. I think the average is about 8, if I remember reading that correctly somewhere. And I think babies are, of course, harder to get. They're just not all that available. But for people who would like to get involved, do you have any advice for them? What steps they should take? Which organizations that they might approach? How would they get started? If they're listening to us today and don't really know how to begin, what would you say to them?
If you're really wanting to adopt, the first thing you need to do is make sure that both you and your spouse, your wife, and both of you get together and agree. Because there's power in agreement. God can bless the decision if you're in agreement. And that's the most important part. We can't have the wife wanting to adopt and the husband not wanting to, and then finally saying, okay, let's do it. That's never going to end well, or the other way around. They both need to come together and agree and pray about it. That's the first thing. I would say the second thing right after that is to go and speak with their spiritual counselor, whether it's their pastor or a priest or wherever they go to church, and go talk to them and say, hey, look, this is what we would like to do. Because adoption is very spiritual. This is the bond that I have with my boys, Rick. I can't even imagine that there would be a deeper bond than I have. And they're not my biological children. They're adopted. But this is a spiritual bond. You want them just as much as you want a real child, a biological child, and you give birth pains to them in the process. The process isn't easy. So be prepared for a difficult process. Now, there are different venues for people to adopt. Like I went through several of them, investigating which would be the best for my family. The international adoption is definitely an option. But I would, just as you said, suggest that we look right here in America. There are so many children,
Right.
so many orphanages. So you can go to an orphanage, you can go to an adoption agency and do that process. But I really feel strongly, and this is what I advocate the most, is the fostering and the adopting through foster care. Because these are children who really need a loving home, who've had it pretty bad. And if you're up to this challenge. Now, you can go through foster to adopt, and you don't have to have an open adoption where the parents keep in touch with you. You can definitely decide to keep it a closed adoption and not have that contact, because that's one of the fears that a lot of parents have. Or you can choose to have an open adoption and let the parents still be involved in the child's life. Either way that you choose, again, go back to that being in agreement with your spouse. That's really, really important, Rick.
Thanks for that. One of the issues that I have come across recently that just seems to be occupying a lot of my thoughts, and I'm really trying to ascertain if this is something that I need to respond to. If it is, I'm not sure how to do it yet, but I'm certainly giving a lot of thought to it. And that is that there are kids who have been in the system who are aging out of the system. And when they turn 21, they're released, and they're just put out into the world, regardless of their background, regardless of what they've been through. Regardless of whether they've been prepared to face life, they're sent out into the world without any more support or very little support, and they may be young adults that are beyond the time for traditional parenting to have been instrumental in their life. But they still need to be fathered, and I think mentoring becomes so incredibly important for these particular individuals, especially with their options being so bleak and their opportunities being so less than desirable, and they're so susceptible to all of the the negative components of society, and there are plenty of people willing to gobble them up and make them a part of negative circumstances. So I'm concerned about that. I don't really. You're just a good guy who works in this in this fatherless area, and I wanted to bring that up. Have you got any experience, or have you addressed this yourself, or do you know of work that's being done to work with these young people that are turning 21 and aging out of the system?
Rick, that's a very important point that you're talking about right now. These children in Texas are released when they're 18. They're not even 21.
Wow.
And just like any other governmental institution, they just follow the rule. It's very black and white. Today's your 18th birthday. Tomorrow you move out. But I'm not ready for it. I don't have a job. I don't have anywhere to live. It doesn't matter. Find somewhere to live. Terrible. Job, you're out. And although that's an important part of growing up, this is not the way to launch a child out into the world. And it's definitely creating a ton of problems. In my line of work, as an area manager for this chain of restaurants here in Texas, a lot of these kids that work there, they're mostly kids. Most of them are high school kids or early college kids, and some of them don't even go to school because they've been through foster care, adoption, etc. They look at me as a fatherly figure, and they come up to me and they tell me things. Hey,
sure.
We've lost some good kids to gangs. They were trying to get their life straight. They came to get a job with us. We tried to help them, and the next thing you know, they're not showing up to work, and they're on drugs and getting arrested. And it's a big issue. It's a very big issue. And we should be concerned because everybody needs a family.
Right.
Children, no matter if they're 17 years old, should be adopted. The day that we adopted our second child, there was a family there that were adopting 6 children.
Wow.
6 children, all of them between the ages of 15 and 17. And when I talked to them, they were saying the reason we're doing this is because even if it's for a year or two, they need to have a family. And they've been doing this for several years, so they've adopted something like 30 or 35
Wow.
children or something like that over the years, but they adopt them when they're about ready to age out. And they say Thanksgivings are fantastic because they all come home, they think it's their home, and they give them, even if it's for a year or two, a very loving environment, a nurturing environment. They don't have to move out when they're 18. They can stay there until they go to college, whatever the case is. there's a lot of incentives for people to adopt through the foster care system. One of them is actually that they get to go to the state college of their choice with a free scholarship if they're actually adopted before they turn 18.
Wow,
So
that's
the big
great.
fears that people have in adopting is, I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford to send them off to school. Colleges are expensive. Well,
Sure.
here's your incentive. If you adopt a child 13, 14, 15 years old before they age out, you don't have to worry about them going to college because they'll have a scholarship. And so that's what they do. They send them off to college. They work with them. I think that there's a niche for that. That wasn't our niche. Our niche was in the baby department. But there's a niche for that. And it's very important because, as you know, as the family goes, so goes the nation. We need to be concerned about that because a lot of these children don't know what a family is. And the closest thing they have to a family is the gang that brings them into their family.
Well, that's an amazing story. This must be a really wonderful couple, and I agree. It's not just a year or two that they might still have them, but it's the many years in the future that gives them a family connection and a point to return to and a feeling of home and belonging, and I can see that is just an incredible thing. There's so many moving parts to this whole fatherless issue, and we certainly can't exhaust all of them today, but I do want to move on to another part of the dynamics of fatherlessness, and that is the number of children living in single-parent homes has nearly doubled since 1960. And the Washington Times analyzed the most recent census data, showing that the percentage of two-family homes has dropped significantly over the last decade in all 50 states.
Yeah.
But even as the total number of American households with children has increased by 160,000, the number of two-parent households has decreased by 1.2 million. And today, 1/3 of American children, which is a total of 15 million kids, are being raised without their biological father in the home. And then another nearly 5 million children are living without their biological mother in the home. And 1 out of 3 kids without their biological fathers makes fatherlessness a pandemic in my mind. This is a huge problem.
It is.
And then you get the additional statistics, and I'm sure that you can quote some of them too from your research and work. But the kids that are 4 times more likely to be in poverty, to get into trouble, to be incarcerated, to get into violent crime, illegal drugs, and all of this has been pretty well documented as fatherlessness as being a cause of this increased susceptibility for children. What's been your experience with that?
Rick, you're touching a nerve here with in a good way, with something that's really near and dear with me. Is that, as you know, because you and I have talked a little bit about this, we both grew up fatherless. Right. We understand the whole issue about growing up fatherless. I should be dead right now, according to the stats. I should be either in jail or dead or just in a really bad situation. It was by the grace of God that and by a very strong-willed woman, my mom, that I am not dead or in jail. These children who are growing up fatherless are definitely going to grow up with a lot of issues. And let me talk about that for a second. You mentioned the fact that back in the 1960s, there wasn't as much fatherlessness. And let me give you the stats. 8% of homes in the 1960s, 8% were fatherless.
Yeah.
Most of them in the 1960s were fatherless because of war or death. Yeah, there was some divorce, but those were the main causes. Today, well, let's just fast forward to the year 2010. In 2010, it was around 36% were fatherless. Right now, we're looking at closer to 40% in 2017.
Yeah.
1 in every 3 children will go to bed tonight in a home without a dad. And that is definitely a pandemic. Dads are important. A lot of people don't understand why a man is important. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons why so many children are growing up fatherless today is because there's a lot of women who are deciding to have children without the father. They want the child, but they don't want the baggage of the dad, of the man with them. And so they think, and that's okay if that's what they want to think, that they're going to be able to bring up this child by themselves. And let me tell you, they can. My mom is a good example. She brought me up and she did a decent job. But there's still a need for a dad. When I grew up and I didn't know how to be a husband, and I didn't know how to be a dad, I had to go back and figure that out on my own. I didn't have anyone to go back and look at. Now, one of the other reasons that a lot of women say, well, we don't need the man, is because, well, obviously they have issues, they have problems, and it's not good for the children to see that. But let me flip that around. They have issues, they have problems. The children need to see that. They also need to see how mom and dad resolve those problems. Because if they don't resolve those problems, or if they do, either way, this is going to be an experience for them as they grow up. Dads are important. Dads are important because there's a lot of things and conversations and aspects of maleness that moms cannot give to the boys, specifically to the boys. Little girls growing up without their father hugging them and having that physical touch with them, when they grow up, they're going to crave that masculine touch in the wrong way. And so we end up with a lot of issues today where 76% of teenage pregnancies are due or come out of fatherless homes. 86% of men in jail today come from fatherless homes. Hallmark did something really interesting. I don't know if you read about this, but they did something really interesting a few years ago. They decided they would give away a whole bunch of Mother's Day cards to the inmates so that they could mail them to their moms. And it was such a success, they decided to do the same thing for Father's Day. They couldn't give away the cards on Father's Day.
Wow.
It was amazing.
Wow.
Children that are hooked on drugs or that have behavioral issues, not all of them, but a great number of them, above 70%, come from fatherless homes. Teenage suicide, teenage runaways, the majority of them come from fatherless homes. And so you cannot tell me that this is not a pandemic. It is. It's very much so, and it's very concerning. And if you love America, this is something you have to be paying attention to right now.
Yeah, I don't know how many times, throughout my life, and I mean, I can relate to what you're saying because I didn't know how to be a good husband. I didn't know how to be a good father. I had a good heart, but I had a lot of dysfunction, and there were so many, issues that kept arising, in my life. I don't know how many times my internal dialogue when I got into tough situations was, man, why wasn't my dad there to tell me this, to show me this, to teach me this? And, well into my adult life, I still had that internal dialogue going on where I, was constantly reflecting back on my feeling of not having a dad and believing that was a detriment. Nobody had to tell me that was a bad thing in my life. I felt it. I sensed it. I believed it. I knew it. And so, there's another. I came across this recently, and I'm somewhat shocked by this because I was aware of this to a degree, but not to this point. And so during the same time frame, about in the 60s, as the feminist movement gained momentum, a woman by the name of Simone de Beauvoir wrote this in 1949. She said, "A parasite sucking out the living strength of another organism. The housewife's labor does not even tend toward the creation of anything durable. A woman's work within the home is not directly useful to society and produces nothing. The housewife is subordinate, secondary, and parasitic. It is for their common welfare that the situation must be altered by prohibiting marriage as a career for a woman." 26 years later, in 1975, the same woman wrote, "As long as the family and the myth of the family and the myth of maternity and the maternal instinct are not destroyed, women will still be oppressed. No woman should be authorized to stay at home and raise her children. Society should be totally different. Women should not have that choice, precisely because if there is such a choice, too many women will choose it. It is a way of forcing women into a certain direction. During the 60s, there was so much that was going on. I was just a small child, but as I research and I study and I put some of these things together, it was really a turning point. There were so many things, going on at the time that ended up, I think, contributing significantly to this foundational root cause of the family being broken up and not being understood, respected, valued, and all of those things. And I think you would agree with me on this statement here, but I think the lack of relationship with our biological dads is a direct result of our lack of relationship with our spiritual dad.
Yes.
Another, would you say that that's a contributing cause in your thinking?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take it a step further. And the kind of relationship that you have with your dad is the kind of relationship you're going to project upon your Heavenly Father.
Yeah, I did it.
If your dad was absent, it's no wonder a lot of men don't seek God, don't go to church, because what for? I grew up without a dad. I don't understand this relationship. And so they don't have that relationship. If your relationship with your dad was that of where your dad was beating you up and putting you down, then you're going to have that same concept of God in your life. And so, yes, absolutely. I think to answer your question, yes, this is a contributing factor. What happened back in the 60s is definitely a seed as to where we are today, where fathers are viewed as not necessary, as we can do it without the guys. And you might be able to get along without a father, but you're not going to thrive. It's not. I can't even imagine where my life or your life, Rick, would be today if we had a father there all the way through until we got married and off, and even after, because our fathers are still our fathers even after we get married. They give advice, they give counseling, they pray for us, they build us up, they tell us which direction to go, and I think that's very important.
Something about that sense of worthiness, identity. Knowing who you are, there is just some component in there that has a place, and when it's missing, I think the reality is we see the ramifications of not receiving it, not getting it. CNSnews.com put this out recently. Educational expert William James said that there is a correlation between the decline of U.S. public schools and the U.S. Supreme Court's decisions of 1962 and 63 that school-sponsored Bible reading was unconstitutional. He went on to say, and I'm quoting here, "One can argue, and some have, that the decision by the Supreme Court in a series of those three decisions in 62 and 63 to remove the Bible and prayer from our public schools may be the most spiritually significant event in our nation's history over the course of the last 55 years. He went on to say in 1963, there were 5 negative developments that started showing up in public schools after these decisions. One was academic achievement plummeted, including SAT scores. There was an increased rate of out-of-wedlock births. There was an increase in illegal drug use and an increase in juvenile crime and a deterioration of school behavior. So he goes on to say that we need to realize that these actions do have consequences. He's a professor at the State College in Long Beach and a senior fellow at Witherspoon Institute, Princeton, New Jersey. He declared that when we remove this moral fiber and the moral emphasis, these are the kind of results that you can expect to see. Other facts in this report included a comparison between the top 5 complaints of teachers between the years of 1940 and 1962. Here were their top complaints. The kids were talking too much. They were chewing gum in class. They were making noise. They were running in the halls, and they were getting out of line. But in 1963 until now, the 5 dominant complaints of teachers are rape, robbery, assault, burglary, and arson. So I think there is an absolute undeniable correlation between the role of fathers when they're in the home and engaged with their children and when they're not. Now, I am 100% supporter of women's rights, but the feminist movement began to thrive during this same period of time, and they have not been a good representation of women's rights. They've had their own agenda. As I read from this woman, Simone Beauvoir, there was an intent all along. And I think one of the things that has become so negative and obvious in our society right now is that during this same time, when all of these things were going on, men became disoriented and they lost their place. Didn't even know where they belonged or what they needed to do. So I know that much of what you do is, is geared toward helping men find their place, understand their role, be better men, be better fathers, be better husbands. And the Lord knows we all, could use as much of this, good seasoned training.
Yeah.
To help us out. So when it comes to your work with Manly Training, a ministry that you started, give us some history about that and what it is that you're trying to accomplish with that.
Well, so I started to write a long time ago, and unfortunately, I lost a lot of my writings because I never backed things up. I didn't know how computers worked. And so I started to write more recently when we adopted the boys, and I showed some of the writings to my pastor. He said, "You need to put this on a website." He's a good friend of mine, and I told him, I said, "Hey, look, I really don't know anything about websites." He said, "It's easy. Just go to WordPress.com, start one. It's free. If you like it, if it works out for you, you can buy into it and have, they have different memberships and different things you can do." Well, that's where it started, where it's led me through much prayer and much counsel, and more importantly, through the need itself has been like a river just pushing me along, is men asking me questions. Things like, "I'm hooked on porn. I've tried many times to get rid of this. It's affecting our marriage. I've got little children, and I don't know how to get rid of this." I had another person tell me, "Look, I've been hooked on porn for 40-something years, and I want to get rid of this." So something like that all of a sudden became a motive of prayer. And through this prayer, God said, "Look, I created man." So here you have the creation. And I know we're getting into some religious here, but I'm going to have to talk about this because this is how it happened. God spoke into existence everything, but he didn't speak into existence man. When it came to man, he took the earth that he had already created and molded a man and breathed his spirit into him. And that's how he made man. He made him in his own image. He made him to have a relationship with God. He made him so man would know God. And obviously sin entered, and we know the rest. Here we are, year 2017, a very sinful people who need God and who think that we can do it on our own. And we can't. God wants us men to be the men that he created us to be, to go back to that, not necessarily to Adam, but to go back to being the men he created us to be. He has a purpose for you, a reason he created you. There's a reason why I was born where I was born. I grew up where I grew up. There's a reason for all of this. And whatever, I speak English, I speak Spanish, whatever it is that I have, there's a reason for that. And God wants me to use it. And so in that purpose, yes, God created every single man And the website has been just led by men who have asked me, hey, I'm having marital problems. Well, what's the nature of your marital problem? Well, this is what the problem is. I'm really jealous. I don't know how to handle my jealousy. I get mad at my wife. I have explosive anger. And when you go back, and you talked about root problems earlier, when you go back and start looking at what the root issue is in that man, 99% of the times it's a father issue. Whether it's fatherless or they were hurt by their father. They were abandoned. They were, neglected. Dad couldn't care less. He was an alcoholic. He was a raging alcoholic who beat up his kids. Whatever the case is, you go back to that. The father is always the root cause of what happens to the children. These children grow up, and they have their own children. And the cycle continues, and it goes on and on. So what I'm trying to achieve through manly training is to train men to become the men that God created you and I to be. He wants you to be a good husband. He wants you to be a responsible father. He wants you to be a good neighbor. He wants you to be a great citizen. And how do we accomplish these things? We need some guidance. Someone should have taught me that when I was growing up. I didn't have a dad to teach me this. But luckily, we have the Bible. We have God's Word, who in God's Word, we can find answers to just about everything. And when it comes to relationships, wow, the information is just fantastic there, and it works.
Yeah. You were part of, you co-authored a book recently called Godly Men Make Godly Fathers. Give us a little history about how the book came about, who the men were that you were involved with. Yeah, there it is. It's available on Amazon.
It is. It's available on Amazon. If you want to get on Amazon, actually the ebook just came out. It makes a great Christmas present. If you want to support manly training, though, get it through the manly training website, because the proceeds will come to me and to manly training and to what we're trying to do here. This was a collaborative effort. Doug Laughlin, he's a great author. He's now a great friend. Doug Laughlin wrote several books. One of his books that I most enjoyed reading was Go Ask Your Dad. And so he approached me one day. He came across my website and said, Edward, would you write a chapter in a book that I'm putting together with 15 other godly men? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And so this book was my way in to becoming an author. I already do a lot of writing, and it's all in the website. But this was my way into actually becoming a published author. But I don't get royalties or anything out of the sale of this book. The royalties and everything go back to Doug Laughlin, who put this whole thing together and allowed us, these 15 men who've never been published before, to contribute to it. And so that's how that book came about. Go ahead.
Yeah. Give me your definition, your explanation, your meaning when you use the phrase godly men. What are you really saying?
Well, a godly man is a man who reflects God's character. This is why we were created. If you go back to the book of Genesis, to the very beginning, the purpose for God creating man was so that we would reflect his glory. And then he created woman. And we're going to go back just a second to talk about the feminist movement here, if we are not careful. But he created woman, and together he formed a marriage. He was the author and creator of a marriage. He formed Adam and Eve and brought them together. And the purpose for bringing them together was not just so they could have children. That was secondary. That was an important part. That was actually a commandment. Go and fill the earth. But the reason he brought them together was so that we together, this marriage, could reflect God's glory on earth. There's a lot of marriages that do not reflect God's glory on earth.
Yeah. Do you think that there is a difference between religion and spirituality?
Yes, absolutely. Religion is nothing more than a whole set of rules that you have to live by in order to try to get yourself into heaven. And what I teach is a relationship with God, a spiritual relationship with God, in which there's nothing at all that you can do to go to heaven. Nothing at all. It's completely different than religion. Religion tells you you have to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and if you do all these things, you may go to heaven. When you get there, we're going to weigh your good deeds and your bad deeds, and we're going to see if you actually go to heaven, or you go to hell, or you go to purgatory, and pay back. This is a religion, and there's many kinds of religions, of course. This is what a religion does. Any kind of religion tells you you have to, become a vegetarian in order to go to heaven. You have to.
There's rules.
Rules and rules and rules and rules.
Yeah.
And I'm talking about rules. I'm talking about a relationship with God, in which, when you read the Bible, God tells you, look, this is how I want you to live your life. Not because this is your way to heaven, but because this is going to make you prosperous, because this is going to make you happy, because this is going to bring blessings to you, to your. And so then it becomes more of a relationship like I wish I had with my father. Now I have a relationship with my heavenly Father who teaches me these things. Like, oh, okay, great. This is fantastic. So how do I do this? How do I become a good husband, God? Oh, well, first of all, respect your wife. Oh, that's great. Okay, what else? Love her. Okay, I love her. What else? Talk to her. And all of these things are written in the Bible. And then when she wants to know how to be a good wife, oh, well, respect your husband and honor him, et cetera, et cetera.
Part of my journey sort of went from being very religious and probably not that spiritual to being a lot less religious and a lot more spiritual.
Yeah.
My understanding of God today is much different than, it was even a few years ago. How do you describe God? Someone said, describe God to me. How would you describe God? What is there a word or a phrase? What would you use?
That's a tough question. It's very tough to describe God, because obviously God is God, and no man has ever seen God, and He's holy, and so in our quest to find out who God is, you must have a relationship. Okay, let's go back. Who is my wife? I never knew my wife until I met her. And then I still didn't know her. I just saw her like, wowza, she's a beautiful woman. I want to marry that gal. And so what did I have to do? I had to start talking with her and listening to her. And in that relationship with her is how, after 25 years now, we have known each other. I can tell you now who my wife is after 25 years. And I think I might still have some work to do. With God, it's the same way. The more you talk with God, the more you listen to Him, the more you read His Word, the more you get involved in becoming like God, or godlike, which is what godly means, the more you start understanding God. I didn't understand how to be a father until I actually had children in my house and said, this is an awesome responsibility. When I was holding a little infant in my arms saying, this little baby would die if I didn't take care of him. When I have now a 5 and a 6 and a 9-year-old, and I'm trying to bless them, and they don't let me bless them because they're so stubborn in their ways, I go like, oh, this is what God means. And so the whole relationship with God is a reflection of how how our relationship is with our family, and with our neighbors, and with our friends. And so in order to know who God is and to be able to describe Him, we need to know each other. We need to know Him through His Word and through prayer.
Man, look, thanks for being with us. I wish you much success in all that you're doing, and I appreciate what you're addressing the issues that we're facing in society, and offering hope and solution and some tools along the way. There will be an article that comes along with the program when it goes up, and all of your links will be there. But immediately, for people to reach out to you and get connected with you, manlytraining.com is the best place to do it.
Absolutely. Manlytraining.com. There's a link there for you to contact me. And I look forward to getting emails from whoever is interested in knowing more about Manly Training.
Sure. I hope people do reach out to you. I'm always interested in communicating with the audience. You can reach me at rickonlife@gmail.com. I'm your host, Rick Amitin. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Edward, for taking the time to be with us today. And remember, whatever is going on in your life, just sprinkle a little love on it. I'll see you next time.